Welcome to Deep Thought, Culture and Relationships. Now, and this is something even myself might have been guilty of, is seeing relationships as just pure. Now, as much as I talk about culture, I don't think I make it clear that culture and relationships are intertwined. When people interact, like if we lived in a totally natural environment, we didn't have culture, male and females would mate and have children as soon as they hit puberty. As soon as they get that rush, they would go out and find someone. And in fact, in some indigenous cultures, that's when women would have babies, because they tended to be closer to actual nature. And even they had a culture anyway. They would facilitate ways to get these boys and girls together safely without any social disruptions. But if you allowed it, but culture says, particularly in this country, we limit that for myriad reasons, good reasons, very good reasons. Because if we just simply allow just males and females to mate, especially in a culture which promotes a nuclear family, and a 14-year-old ain't ready for a family. Maybe, the only way we could do that is if we had a culture that promoted extended families, as I touched on briefly in a previous podcast this week. Yes, you could have that, because in those cultures where the children do mate, they might have been, the babies were raised primarily by the grandparents. And the grandparents, because they were older and better able. In fact, the children were really belonged to the village and not an individual, but that's a cultural thing. Now, when I say culture and relationships, like, we have to look at any relationship, and I have said this, definitely said this about, you have to look at the culture, the subculture someone's trying to relate in. And those subcultures could be religious. They could be based on activities. It could be two skateboarders trying to get together. It could be based off of music, of course. Social class. Social class itself is a subculture. So it's going to affect, that culture, the subcultures, and then the overall culture, which is informed by, mainly religion, the education system, propaganda system, and whatever images the media is presenting. It will affect how people will interact. Like a big cultural thing is sex. Sex is cultural, isn't it? It's how we have it isn't based on nature. If it's based on nature, people would just mate. Women would just truly mate with the alphas. People think they mating with the alphas now, the select men, whatever term you want to use. Nah, a lot of times it's not, because they got some cultural breaks on it. But no, they would just mate with the strongest, most physically appealing men, just based purely on nature. And then part of the culture is, how women respond or how people respond to it. Like, I'm reading a book now. It's called Kunyatsa, the African Secret to Female Pleasure. And it talked about how in African cultures, meaning continental African cultures, women, to bring pleasure, there's a focus on women's pleasure. But not as much in Western culture. And that affects relationships, because a lot of women will get into relationships not expecting pleasure, or even thinking it's normal. It was a big deal just in the 1950s and 60s to discover, I forgot what year that was, for a European to discover that women had a G-spot. It was like a big deal. It was like, whereas in some indigenous cultures, it was like, really? We always knew it was there. Come on, dog. But it affects it because the culture also informs how people pair bond, how they relate. Now, in a previous podcast on culture, I talked about the nuclear family versus the extended family. And then in this one, of course, I mentioned about in some indigenous cultures, children, the 14-year-olds would have the babies, but it wouldn't have the same stigma cultural wise that we do here. Because in this culture, of course, people are expected to be able to take care of themselves. The whole nuclear family thing, which don't work. But, you get all that. So you have to look at everything. When I've always said that there's no such thing as universal beauty, and even though people try to argue with you, but I'll say no. What you have is a chauvinistic culture that try to say what it says is beautiful, is universal, but it's not. Culturally, there's different things. Even in some cultures, the big thing ain't really even looks. In many cultures, the big thing ain't looks. It's more about personality traits. More Eastern cultures are like this. Western cultures like that. It's not about, or even body size. You have some cultures that promote women being bigger. It's a Western culture thing to have, promote fashion model looking women as, thin women, look like they haven't reached puberty as beautiful. That's a Western thing. You have some cultures that say, hey, if that woman got some girth on her, hello, mama. So it's always an effect. That's why when you counsel men and women on relationships, I try to gauge their social class, their religion's a prickly subject to talk about. I let them volunteer that. I don't even bring it up, but things of that nature, because it affects it. Because it's like, what culture is this person in? And in fact, if at times I think about like matchmaking, but I say, okay, to do that, I would have to have on a questionnaire, okay, what's your economic background? What's your culture? And I'll try to find I will put every cultural indicator in there. It's like, okay, this is a good person for you. This is a vegan new ager. This is a vegan new ager who's upper middle class. A bunch of other stuff, who's interested in this type of music or something like that, because it affects it. It affects, even, like I say, even down to how you have sex, how you look at sex. If you're in a culture that feel like, hey, like you have some cultures that downplay women's pleasure. They just supposed to serve the husband, so he get his stuff off. Or even some cultures that downplay the pleasure for both of them. Usually some type of real fundamentalist religious cultures. It's just like, hey, y'all just having sex for procreation. But that's a cultural thing. That's not a natural thing. The natural thing is, it'd be an orgy out here every day. But that's something to consider, because, like everything else with culture, ultimately culture, it directs us. We come in with a certain state, certain energies, certain dispositions, but what the culture does is direct it. Like my favorite example of that is the kid that's born in a poor neighborhood. Now, the culture there might be dog eat dog, might be the most ruthless survivor, or stuff like that, law of the jungle. But then that same kid born into an upper middle class environment gets to be captain of the sports team, gets to go to the boarding school, gets to go to the elite schools where the leadership ability is brought out. But that's a cultural thing. So it's a very important thing to look at, very important to consider. So, if you want to change things, think about the culture. Think about the culture. So anyway, I know what it is. If y'all have any questions, concerns, anything, chop it up. Tell me what you think about this. Think about the culture that you're in now. Is it serving you? So anyway, that's all I got for today. I'll talk to y'all later. Peace and blessings.